My beloved child, pause here for a moment, because what you are about to hear did not arrive in your life by accident. Do not move past these words as though they are ordinary. Something has shifted in the heart of the one connected to you, and heaven has witnessed every second of it. A realization came upon your soulmate so suddenly, so deeply, that they could no longer hold back the tears they had been hiding from everyone. They tried to breathe through it. They tried to distract themselves. They tried to convince their own heart that they were simply tired, overwhelmed, or remembering too much. But the truth would not leave them alone. It stood before them like a light they could no longer turn away from, and in that moment, they understood something about you that changed the way they saw everything. You must listen carefully, because this was not a small realization. It was not merely a passing thought or a brief wave of emotion. It was the kind of truth that reaches into a person's deepest places and awakens every memory they had buried. Your soulmate suddenly saw the difference between what they assumed about you and who you truly were. They saw the love hidden beneath your silence. They saw the loyalty beneath your distance. They saw the pain you carried without making it anyone else's burden. And the moment those pieces came together, something inside them broke open. For a long time, they believed your silence meant you no longer cared. They believed your withdrawal was rejection. They interpreted your strength as coldness because they could not see the battle taking place beneath the surface. They thought you had moved forward without looking back. They imagined you had forgotten the connection, forgotten the promises spoken through glances, forgotten the moments when neither of you needed words to understand what was happening. But recently, something revealed to them that your silence had never been empty. It had been filled with restraint, longing, dignity, and a love you were trying to protect from becoming wounded beyond repair. That realization brought them to tears. Not because they suddenly felt sorry for themselves, but because they finally understood what it must have cost you to remain quiet when your heart wanted to speak. They began remembering moments when you could have exposed their mistakes, yet you protected their name. They remembered times when you could have demanded answers, yet you chose peace. They remembered the way you looked at them during your last meaningful conversation, and for the first time, they understood what was hidden behind your eyes. You were not asking them to save you. You were asking them to see you. And they did not see you soon enough. This is where the story becomes deeper, because the realization did not come alone. It was triggered by something unexpected. A conversation, a memory, a message, or perhaps a simple moment of stillness caused them to revisit everything they had tried to avoid. They may have heard someone describe a love that does not chase, manipulate, or beg. They may have watched another person lose someone precious because pride delayed an honest conversation. They may have found an old photograph, remembered an exact sentence you once spoke, or heard a song that carried them back to a moment they thought they had forgotten. Whatever the trigger was, it opened a door inside them, and once that door opened, every feeling they had hidden began rushing through. At first, they resisted it. They told themselves not to become emotional. They tried to reason their way out of what their spirit was revealing. They walked around the room. They stared at the ceiling. They picked up their phone and put it down again. They may even have opened your name, looked at your picture, and hesitated. But the more they tried to suppress the truth, the stronger it became. It was as if heaven was whispering, "Look again. You have misunderstood this person. Look again. There was more love there than you allowed yourself to believe. And they looked again. They looked at the past through a different lens. Suddenly, your actions made sense. The times you stepped back were not acts of abandonment. They were moments when you refused to force what needed to be chosen freely. The times you became quiet were not because your heart had gone cold. They were because you feared saying something from pain that could never be taken back. The boundaries you created were not punishment. They were the final shelter for a heart that had already endured too much uncertainty. Your soulmate saw this, and the tears came harder. They realized that while they were waiting for dramatic proof of love, you had been loving them in ways that required no audience. You remembered what mattered to them. You prayed for them even when you did not know whether they were thinking of you. You carried concern for their well-being even when your own heart was exhausted. You celebrated their victories from a distance. You defended them in rooms they never knew you entered. You wanted them to be whole, even if their healing eventually led them somewhere you could not follow. That kind of love is rare, my child. It does not demand to be recognized, but one day its absence becomes impossible to ignore. Your soulmate is now beginning to feel the weight of what they almost lost. This is why the tears overwhelmed them. They were not only crying because they missed you. They were crying because they finally understood the value of what stood before them all along. They saw how easily they had mistaken patience for weakness. They saw how often they allowed fear to speak louder than their heart. They saw how pride made them delay the very conversation that could have changed everything. But there is another layer to this realization, and this is the part they have not yet spoken aloud. They are beginning to understand that you were never asking for perfection. You were asking for honesty. You did not need them to have every answer. You needed them to stop hiding behind uncertainty. You were willing to walk through difficult seasons with them, but you could not keep walking alone while pretending it was a shared journey. You were ready to forgive confusion, mistakes, and fear, but you could not continue accepting silence as though it were love. They now see the difference. They see that you were not trying to pressure them into commitment. You were asking for clarity because your soul was becoming tired of guessing. You were not asking them to promise forever before they were ready. You were asking them not to treat something sacred as though it were disposable. And when they could not meet you in that truth, you chose to protect the part of yourself that was slowly disappearing. That is what shattered them. Your soulmate suddenly imagined what your private nights must have looked like. They imagined you sitting alone, replaying conversations, wondering whether you had misunderstood the connection. They imagined the moments when you nearly reached out but stopped because you feared being met with the same uncertainty. They realized you may have cried without telling anyone. You may have smiled in public while privately questioning whether you were ever truly important to them. You may have carried the pain with such grace that they assumed there was no pain at all. And now they know. The realization was not gentle. It moved through them like thunder. They began connecting every moment they had dismissed. Your delayed replies that were actually attempts to regain emotional control. Your quietness after they spoke carelessly. Your distance after they failed to show up when you needed reassurance. The strength in your voice when you finally said you could no longer remain in confusion. They remembered it all, and they realized you were not leaving because you did not love them. You were leaving because loving them had begun to cost you your peace. For the first time, they felt what those words truly meant. There is something humbling about realizing that someone did not walk away because the love disappeared. They walked away because the love was too deep to keep being treated casually. Your soulmate is facing that truth now. They are realizing that the connection was never imaginary, but it required courage, and they allowed fear to make too many decisions. Yet there is more. During this emotional moment, another realization entered their heart. They began to see that you had changed. Not in the way they once feared, but in the way your soul needed. You became stronger. You stopped begging to be understood. You stopped over-explaining your intentions. You stopped trying to prove that your love was real to someone who already knew it but was afraid to receive it. Your growth frightened them at first. They mistook your peace for indifference. They mistook your self-respect for emotional distance. But now they see that your transformation was not designed to punish them. It was designed to save you. They understand that you could not remain the version of yourself who waited endlessly while receiving only fragments. You had to become someone who honored the love within you. You had to remember that being compassionate did not mean accepting inconsistency. You had to learn that patience without truth eventually becomes self-abandonment. You had to stop calling confusion a divine test when part of the lesson was learning to choose yourself. Your soulmate felt this realization in the deepest part of their spirit. They saw that while they were hesitating, you were healing. While they were avoiding the truth, you were becoming someone who could no longer be reached by empty words. And suddenly, they became afraid. Not of losing control, but of arriving too late. That fear brought another wave of tears. They began asking themselves questions they had avoided for a long time. What if you no longer believe them? What if the apology comes after your heart has finally found peace? What if the door is not locked, but you are no longer standing behind it? What if the love remains, yet the version of you who tolerated uncertainty is gone forever? These questions are now following them everywhere. They may appear calm on the outside. They may continue their routine. They may speak to others as though nothing has changed. But inside, a conversation is repeating. They are rehearsing what they would say if they stood before you without pride, without defenses, without excuses. They are imagining your expression. They are wondering whether your eyes would still soften when you saw them or whether they would finally see the consequences of waiting too long. They want to tell you that they understand now. They want to tell you they see the nights you suffered in silence. They want to admit that they noticed your loyalty but became accustomed to it. They want to confess that they felt the connection long before they were willing to name it. They want to say that every time they tried to move on emotionally, something pulled them back to the truth of you. But there is one confession they are still afraid to make. They are afraid to admit that part of them always knew. They always knew your silence was not indifference. They always knew your distance carried pain. They always knew you were waiting for honesty. But acknowledging that truth would have forced them to confront their own behavior. It would have required them to stop blaming timing, circumstances, other people, and uncertainty. It would have required them to admit that fear, not fate, was keeping the two of you apart. This is the realization that overwhelmed them most. They understood that heaven had placed signs around them again and again, not to manipulate their choices, but to awaken their courage. They were reminded of you in unexpected places. Your name appeared when they tried not to think of you. Familiar phrases returned. Dreams carried your presence. Their heart became unsettled whenever they imagined a future in which you were only a memory. They dismissed these moments because accepting them felt dangerous. Loving you meant becoming vulnerable. Loving you meant allowing someone to see the parts of them they had hidden even from themselves. Loving you meant risking rejection, disappointment, and change. So they convinced themselves that remaining silent was safer. But silence did not protect them. It only delayed the truth. Now, the truth has arrived all at once. Your soulmate is realizing that they did not need to be fearless. They only needed to be sincere. They did not need a perfect plan. They only needed to take one honest step. They did not need to guarantee the outcome. They only needed to stop pretending that the connection meant less than it did. This realization has begun changing something inside them. The tears were not merely an emotional release. They marked the moment their resistance weakened. Something that had been frozen is beginning to move. A decision is forming beneath the surface, although they have not yet revealed it. They are no longer asking whether they feel something for you. They know. They are no longer asking whether your absence affects them. It does. They are now asking what they are willing to do before the distance becomes permanent. And that question has brought them to a crossroads. One path allows them to continue hiding. It allows them to preserve their pride, maintain appearances, and avoid the discomfort of an honest conversation. But they now see where that path leads. It leads to regret. It leads to watching you become a memory while pretending they are at peace. It leads to carrying words they never spoke into every future connection. The other path requires courage. It requires them to approach you without expecting immediate forgiveness or reassurance. It requires them to honor the person you have become rather than expecting access to the version of you who once waited without limits. Your soulmate is standing between these two paths now. That is why their emotions have become so intense. Their spirit knows that a moment of decision is approaching. They can feel that the season of avoidance is ending. They can feel that continuing as before is no longer possible. Something within them is urging them to act, not impulsively, but honestly. Yet before they take that step, heaven wants you to understand your own position. You are not being asked to abandon your peace. You are not being asked to forget what happened. You are not being asked to open a door simply because someone finally understands the pain they caused. Their realization is meaningful, but your healing is meaningful too. The love within you was never foolish. Your compassion was never a weakness. Your hope was never something to be ashamed of. But this season has taught you that genuine connection must be supported by truth, consistency, and action. Your soulmate's tears do not erase the past, but they reveal that the past is no longer hidden from them. They see it. They feel it. And they are beginning to understand what must change. There is a reason you are receiving this message now. You may have sensed a strange emotional shift recently. You may have thought of them unexpectedly. You may have felt a heaviness that did not seem entirely your own. You may have dreamed of a conversation, a reunion, or an apology that felt unusually vivid. These moments do not guarantee a specific outcome, but within this story, they symbolize the unresolved truth moving closer to the surface. Something has been awakened. Your soulmate is no longer comfortable with the story they once told themselves. They cannot keep saying you did not care. They cannot keep pretending the connection was one-sided. They cannot keep blaming your distance without acknowledging what caused it. The realization has removed the shelter of denial. Now they must face themselves. And facing themselves has been more painful than missing you. They have begun remembering the exact moment when your energy changed. They remember when your words became fewer. They remember when your questions stopped. They remember when you no longer tried to convince them to understand. At the time, they may have felt relieved because the pressure disappeared. But now they understand that it was not peace. It was the sound of your heart accepting that it could no longer force someone to meet it. That memory is haunting them. They are realizing that your quiet departure was not sudden. It happened in pieces. A little hope left each time they dismissed your feelings. A little trust faded each time they promised clarity but returned with silence. A little warmth withdrew each time you had to question your place in their life. By the time they noticed the distance, you had already grieved much of the connection alone. This is what made them cry. They understood that they were only beginning to feel a pain you had already survived. They are now standing where you once stood. Waiting, wondering, replaying, hoping. The roles have shifted, not as punishment, but as revelation. Sometimes the heart cannot understand what it has caused until it experiences the echo of its own choices. But your soulmate's realization carries more than regret. It carries love. A love they tried to minimize has become impossible to deny. They have begun comparing every shallow interaction with the depth they felt around you. They remember how seen they felt even when they were afraid of being known. They remember the strange peace in your presence. They remember how your words remained with them long after conversations ended. They realize that what frightened them about you was not that you demanded too much. It was that you awakened too much. You awakened the part of them that wanted a real life, not a performance. You awakened their desire to stop pretending they were unaffected. You awakened wounds they had hidden beneath independence. You awakened hope, and hope felt dangerous because it gave them something precious to lose. So they pulled away from the very thing they desired. Now they understand the contradiction. And the understanding has changed the atmosphere around them. They are closer than ever to doing something they once believed they would never have the courage to do. They are considering breaking the silence. They are considering saying what they should have said before. They are considering approaching you not with a dramatic promise, but with the truth. But before that moment arrives, there is one final realization unfolding inside them, and it is greater than everything they have understood so far. They have begun to question whether the love they feel is only about wanting you back. Or whether loving you now means being willing to honor your freedom, even if your answer is not what they hope for. That question has brought them to their knees emotionally. Because for the first time, they are no longer thinking only about their fear of losing you. They are thinking about what you deserve. They are asking whether they are ready to become consistent. Whether they are ready to communicate without disappearing. Whether they are ready to face difficult emotions rather than run from them. Whether they are ready to love you in a way that feels safe, visible, and real. And somewhere in the middle of those questions, they realized something that made their entire body go still. There is a truth about the last time you pulled away that they completely misunderstood. They believed you left because you had given up on them. But a memory has returned, one sentence, one look, one final gesture. And now they understand that you were not giving up. You were waiting for them to notice something. Something they failed to see until now. And when they finally understood what that final gesture truly meant, they reached for their phone through trembling hands, opened the message they never answered, and saw words that changed the meaning of your entire story. But what they discovered in that message, and the decision they made immediately after reading it, is the part heaven has not yet revealed.